Long ago, before the Empire's shadow stretched across the stars, before the Clone Wars tore the galaxy apart, before even the ancient Republic rose to power, there existed a Jedi. Not just any Jedi, but perhaps the greatest of his age. A master of the lightsaber, whose blade moved like liquid light. A philosopher, whose understanding of the Force was unmatched. A warrior, whose very name commanded respect across 1,000 worlds. But this is not a story of triumph. Picture a man standing at the edge of an abyss, staring into darkness so deep it stares back. Imagine the moment when everything you believed, everything you fought for, everything you were begins to crack and crumble like ancient stone. What happens when the pursuit of truth leads you down a path from which there is no return? In the depths of Korriban's Valley of the Dark Lords, beneath crimson sands and blood-red skies, there lies a tomb. Inside that tomb, 3 bodies rest in silence. And somewhere in the shadows between life and death, a spirit lingers, trapped for 4,000 years, unable to remember which corpse was once him, unable to recall his own name, unable to understand how the greatest Jedi Master of his generation became the very first Dark Lord of the Sith. His name was Ajunta Pall. And tonight we uncover his complete story, from the gleaming halls of the Jedi Temple to the crimson deserts of Korriban, from idealistic master to corrupted god, from living legend to tormented ghost. Tonight we journey into one of Star Wars legend's most tragic and foundational tales. But here's something interesting. 71% of you watching right now haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these deep dives into Star Wars lore, hitting that subscribe button genuinely helps this channel grow and bring you more stories like this. Drop a comment letting me know where in the galaxy you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our community span across different time zones and countries. So dim the lights, settle into your blanket, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin this ancient tale together. 7,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Galactic Republic stood at the height of its glory. The Jedi Order, guardians of peace and justice, maintained temples on 100 worlds, and on Coruscant, beneath the endless city planet's gleaming spires, the great Jedi Temple rose like a mountain of stone and light. Within those sacred halls walked Ajunta Pall. To call him merely talented would be an insult to his legacy. Ajunta Pall was extraordinary. His connection to the Force flowed as naturally as breathing. While other Padawans struggled to lift pebbles, young Pall moved boulders with a thought. While others took years to construct their lightsabers, his blade ignited on the first attempt, humming with perfect clarity. By the time he reached knighthood, whispers already spread through the temple. Masters spoke his name with a mixture of pride and something else, something like concern, because Ajunta Pall did not simply follow the teachings. He questioned them, tested them, pushed against their boundaries like a river testing the strength of a dam. His lightsaber form was unlike anything the Order had seen in generations. Fluid, unpredictable, devastating. During exhibition matches, other Jedi would gather just to watch him move. His blade seemed to dance between forms, creating something entirely new, something uniquely his own. Challengers fell before him like wheat before the scythe, not through brutality, but through perfect, terrible precision. The Council noticed, of course. How could they not? They elevated him to master at an age younger than most achieved knighthood. They assigned him to the most prestigious positions, teaching, diplomacy, leading missions into the unknown regions. Wherever the Order needed brilliance, they sent Ajunta Pall. But brilliance, like fire, can illuminate or consume. Pall's quarters in the temple became a place of endless study. While others meditated in silence, he pored over ancient texts, some so old their pages crumbled at his touch. Holocrons lined his shelves, their crystalline structures glowing softly in the darkness. He studied the Force not as a tool, but as a mystery to be solved, a puzzle with pieces scattered across millennia. And slowly, quietly, a question began to form in his mind. A question that would not leave him alone, that whispered to him during meditation, that haunted his dreams. Why does the Jedi Order fear knowledge? The archives held restricted sections, sealed away from all but the highest masters. Techniques were forbidden, powers were deemed too dangerous to study. The Council spoke constantly of balance, of limitation, of the dangers of going too far. But to Ajunta Pall, this seemed like closing your eyes and calling it wisdom. How could you understand something if you refused to examine it fully? How could you maintain balance if you only explored one side? These thoughts circled in his mind, like vultures over a dying sun, and in the shadows of the temple, in forgotten corners of the archives, others were beginning to think the same dangerous thoughts. It began innocently enough, as most catastrophes do. Late one evening, while researching ancient Force techniques in the temple archives, Ajunta Pall discovered something peculiar. A reference in a 1,000-year-old text mentioned practices that no longer existed in Jedi teaching, not because they had been forgotten, but because they had been deliberately removed, erased, hidden away in sections of the archives that required Council permission to access. His curiosity, once merely intellectual, became something sharper, something hungrier. He applied for access. The Council denied him. When he pressed for reasons, they offered only vague warnings about the dangers of certain knowledge, about paths that led to darkness, about the importance of accepting wisdom without questioning its foundations. But Ajunta Pall had never been good at accepting limitations. The restricted archives were not as secure as the Council believed. Toll had spent years in these halls. He knew the routines of the archive guards, the blind spots in their patrols, the forgotten maintenance passages that wound through the temple's ancient bones. Getting inside was almost disappointingly easy. What he found there changed everything. Texts dating back to the formation of the Jedi Order itself, records of Force abilities that seemed impossible, techniques for manipulating matter at the molecular level, methods for extending life far beyond natural limits, ways to bend the very fabric of reality through will alone, not through evil, not through malice, simply through understanding principles that the modern order had deemed too dangerous for study. Pall spent weeks sneaking into the restricted sections, copying texts by hand, memorizing passages, slowly assembling a picture that the Council had tried to erase. The Force was far vaster than what the Jedi taught, far more complex, and the Order's limitations were not about safety, they were about control. He was not alone in this realization. Master Zogzan found him there one night, deep in the restricted vaults. She was older than Pall by 2 decades, a renowned scholar whose treatises on Force theory were studied throughout the Order. He expected her to report him. Instead, she asked what he was reading. They talked until dawn. Zogzan had been conducting her own secret research. She too had noticed the gaps in Jedi teaching, the deliberate omissions, the way certain questions were discouraged rather than answered. She had her own collection of forbidden texts, hidden away in her quarters, her own experiments with techniques the Council would never approve. Over the following months, they discovered others. Karnus Moore, a brilliant but arrogant master who specialized in Sith history and had developed an uncomfortable fascination with their techniques. Remulus Draper, whose experiments with Force alchemy had produced results that terrified and amazed in equal measure. Sorzu Sin, a former agricultural specialist who had discovered ways to accelerate plant growth and alter living tissue through Force manipulation. Each of them had been quietly pushing against the Order's boundaries. Each had been warned. Each had continued anyway. They began meeting in secret, gathering in Pall's quarters after midnight when the temple slept. What started as philosophical discussions evolved into something more practical. They shared their findings, compared their research, and slowly, carefully, they began to experiment. The results were extraordinary. Pall discovered he could sense life forces with a clarity that made traditional Jedi techniques seem blind by comparison. He could feel the pulse of energy in every living thing, could trace the connections between beings like threads in an infinite web. More than that, he found he could manipulate those connections, strengthen them, weaken them, redirect them. Exo-Exam developed a form of force persuasion that went far beyond the simple mind tricks Jedi used on the weak-willed. She could plant suggestions so deep they seemed like the target's own thoughts, could reshape memories, could, with enough time and focus, fundamentally alter a person's beliefs and personality. Carnus Moore created what he called a Sith amulet, a talisman infused with dark side energy that could enhance the wearer's power exponentially. It was a crude first attempt, unstable and dangerous, but it worked. The implications were staggering. Remulus Draper pushed alchemy further than any Jedi had in a millennium, creating living creatures from base matter. His early experiments produced only simple organisms, but each success brought him closer to something revolutionary, the ability to create life itself through the Force. And Sorzu Sin, brilliant and terrifying Sorzu Sin, discovered she could alter existing life on a fundamental level. Plants that grew overnight, animals whose strength and intelligence increased tenfold. She was rewriting the code of life itself, playing with forces that the Council insisted should never be touched. They were not monsters, not yet. They genuinely believed they were expanding the boundaries of knowledge, pushing the Order toward a more complete understanding of the Force. They saw themselves as pioneers, not heretics, visionaries, not villains. But the Force has a way of changing those who delve too deep into its mysteries. The more they experimented with these forbidden techniques, the more they felt themselves shifting. It was subtle at first, a shortness of temper that had never been there before, an impatience with slower students, a growing contempt for the masters who refused to see what seemed so obvious. The limitations of Jedi teaching felt less like wisdom and more like chains. Ajunta Pall noticed his eyes sometimes appeared different in mirrors. The blue seemed darker, almost amber in certain light. He told himself it was exhaustion, that he needed more sleep. But deep down, he knew better. The dark side was not a switch that flipped. It was a gradient. A slow slope walked one step at a time, each step seeming reasonable, until you looked back and could no longer see where you started. The Council became aware of their activities, though they did not yet know the full extent. Masters began asking pointed questions. Assignments suddenly placed the group on opposite sides of the galaxy. Pall's quarters were searched while he was away, though whoever conducted the search was careful to leave no evidence of their intrusion. The surveillance was clumsy enough that Pall recognized it immediately. They wanted him to know they were watching, a warning, a chance to stop before things went too far. Instead, it only made him angry. Who were they to decide what knowledge was permitted? What gave the Council the right to determine which aspects of the Force could be studied and which must remain forever locked away? The Jedi claimed to serve the light, but they ruled through darkness. The darkness of ignorance. The darkness of fear masquerading as wisdom. During a council session where Pall was presenting research on ancient Force techniques, he made a mistake. He referenced a text that was only available in the restricted archives. The chamber fell silent. Every eye turned to him. Master Arca Jeth, head of the council, asked a simple question. How did you access that text? Pall could have lied, should have lied. Instead, he told the truth. He described his unauthorized entries into the restricted sections, his copying of forbidden texts, his experiments with techniques the council had banned, and then, in a moment of defiant pride, he explained why. because the Order's fear of knowledge was holding them back. Because true understanding required exploring all aspects of the Force, not just the comfortable ones. Because the Jedi had become guardians not of peace, but of stagnation. The Council gave him a choice. Abandon this path immediately, submit his research for destruction, and accept a period of meditation and penance under direct Council supervision, or leave the Order entirely. Ajunta Pall stood in that chamber, surrounded by masters who had once celebrated his brilliance and felt something crystallize inside him. A choice that was not really a choice at all, because he had already gone too far to turn back. Because the power he had touched was too intoxicating to surrender. Because deep down, beneath all his rationalizations about knowledge and freedom, he wanted more. He refused. Within a week, 27 other Jedi joined him. Sho'Xan, Karnas Mul, Remulus Drapar, Sorzes Sin, masters and knights who had been quietly questioning, quietly experimenting, quietly waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to make the break official. They gathered in the temple's western hall and made their declaration before the assembled Order. The Jedi Council's restrictions were not wisdom, but cowardice. True mastery of the Force required studying all its aspects without prejudice or limitation. They would no longer accept the Council's authority over what could and could not be learned. The chamber erupted in chaos. Some Jedi shouted in agreement, others screamed condemnation. Lightsabers ignited on both sides. And in that moment, in that terrible crystallization of ideological divide into physical violence, the galaxy changed forever. The 100-year darkness had begun. What started as a philosophical disagreement became a schism. What started as a schism became a war. And Ajunta Pall, who had only wanted to understand the Force more completely, found himself leading an army against everything he had once sworn to protect. The path to darkness is paved with reasonable steps, and by the time you realize where you are, the way back has vanished behind you. The war did not explode overnight. It metastasized slowly, spreading from the temple on Coruscant to Jedi enclaves across the galaxy like a cancer eating through healthy tissue. At first, the Council tried diplomacy. Envoys were sent to reason with Ajunta Pall and his followers, now calling themselves the Legions of Leto, offering one final chance at reconciliation. These negotiations failed spectacularly. Pall's rhetoric had evolved beyond mere disagreement with Council policy. He now spoke of the Jedi Order as a prison, the Council as jailers, and the light side itself as an incomplete understanding of the Force's true nature. The Dark Jedi, as the Council began calling them, established a base on Relg, a remote world in the Outer Rim. There, away from the Council's watchful eyes, they continued their experiments, and their numbers grew. Dozens more Jedi joined them. Some were idealists who genuinely believed in Pall's vision of unrestricted Force study. Others were simply ambitious, drawn to the promise of power that the dark side offered. Still others had grievances against the Council, old wounds and slights that festered until Pall's rebellion gave them an outlet. The Dark Jedi ranks swelled to nearly 200, a fraction of the Order's total number, but enough to pose a genuine threat. Because what they lacked in numbers, they compensated for in power. The techniques Pall and his inner circle had developed were devastatingly effective in combat. Traditional Jedi, trained to channel the Force through calm and peace, found themselves overwhelmed by opponents who drew strength from passion and rage. Lightning arced from Dark Jedi fingertips, a weapon the Jedi had no defense against. Life-draining techniques left victims as withered husks. Battle meditation turned small Dark Jedi forces into armies that fought with supernatural coordination. The first major engagement occurred above Coruscant itself, a bold and foolish strike by the Dark Jedi, intended to capture the temple and its archives. The battle lasted 3 days. Ships burned in orbit. Debris rained down on the city planet below, And when the smoke cleared, the Dark Jedi had been repelled, but the temple's western wing lay in ruins, 50 Jedi dead, countless civilians caught in the crossfire. War, once theoretical, became horrifyingly real. Ajunta Pall proved to be as brilliant a military commander as he had been a Jedi Master. He divided his forces into strike teams, hitting multiple targets simultaneously, stretching the Order's resources thin. When the Jedi concentrated their forces, Pall would retreat. When they spread out to protect their temples, he would strike with overwhelming power at a single point. The war spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Corellia, Alderaan, Chandrila, Fondor, worlds that had known peace for generations, suddenly found themselves battlegrounds. The Dark Jedi did not discriminate. If a planet harbored a Jedi temple, it became a target. If local governments sided with the Order, their cities burned. The atrocities mounted. On Chandrila, Remulus Drapar unleashed his alchemical creations. Massive beasts, twisted amalgamations of flesh and force energy, tore through Jedi defenses like they were paper. These Leviathans, as they came to be called, required dozens of Jedi working in concert to bring down. They left survivors traumatized, speaking in whispers of monsters from nightmares made flesh. Sorzu's Sin developed techniques for corrupting existing life forms, transforming peaceful creatures into berserker weapons. On Alderaan, she unleashed a plague that turned the planet's native Thranta into ravenous predators. Thousands died before the Jedi could contain the outbreak. The ecological damage lasted for decades. Karnus Mule created more of his Sith amulets, crude but effective talismans that enhanced dark side abilities. His greatest creation, which would later bear his name, could transform living beings into mindless Rakul slaves. He tested it on a village on Taris. Every man, woman and child transformed within hours. The Jedi had to burn the entire settlement to ash. And Ajunta Pall himself became something terrible to behold. His connection to the dark side deepened with every battle, every life taken, every line crossed. His appearance changed. The amber tint in his eyes became permanent, then shifted to yellow, then to a burning gold that seemed to glow in darkness. His skin paled, his features sharpened. He no longer looked like the handsome master who had once taught in the temple. He looked like something carved from ice and hatred. But his power grew exponentially. There are accounts from this period, preserved in Jedi archives, of Pall single-handedly holding off 20 Jedi Masters, of his lightsaber moving so fast it appeared as a solid sphere of crimson light, of force lightning that could arc between multiple targets, jumping from victim to victim like some malevolent intelligence, of his voice alone compelling weaker minds to turn on their allies. He became a legend, a monster. The Jedi told stories about him to frighten Padawans into obedience. Follow the Council's wisdom, they would say, or you might become like Ajunta Pall. The war ground on. Years became decades. An entire generation of Jedi knew nothing but conflict. Children who had been younglings when the war began were now knights, scarred by battles they had fought since adolescence. The galaxy bled. The Republic, still in its relative infancy, teetered on the edge of collapse. But slowly, inexorably, the tide began to turn. The Dark Jedi, for all their power, had a fundamental weakness. The same ambition and passion that made them strong also made them unstable. Infighting was common. Duels over leadership, betrayals, assassinations. Pall maintained control through sheer force of will and superior strength, but even he could not prevent the fractures forming in his ranks. The Jedi Order, meanwhile, adapted. They studied Dark Jedi tactics, developed counters to their techniques, created new forms of lightsaber combat, specifically designed to defend against dark side powers, and most importantly, they endured. The light side did not offer the quick power of the dark, but it granted a resilience, an ability to recover and continue fighting, that the Dark Jedi could not match. The final confrontation came at Korbos, a mining world in the Outer Rim. The Jedi had discovered a major Dark Jedi stronghold there, one of their primary bases for creating alchemical weapons. They gathered their forces, nearly every available Jedi Master, hundreds of knights, thousands of Republic soldiers. It was meant to be a surgical strike. It became a bloodbath. The battle lasted for weeks. The Dark Jedi had fortified the planet extensively, turning its caverns and tunnels into a nightmare maze of traps and ambush points. Leviathans roamed the deeper levels. Sith poisons filled the air in certain chambers. Every meter of ground was paid for in blood. Ajunta Pall commanded the defense personally. He fought like a man possessed, cutting through Jedi ranks like wheat before a scythe. Witnesses described him as being everywhere at once, his crimson blade a harbinger of death, his presence in the Force like a crushing weight that made even masters stumble. But he was not invincible. The Jedi pushed forward, inch by bloody inch. They collapsed tunnels, sealed off sections, systematically dismantling the Dark Jedi defenses. Pall's forces were being surrounded, cut off from retreat. Supplies ran low. Reinforcements could not break through the Jedi blockade. In the deepest chamber of the Korbos stronghold, Ajunta Pall faced the truth he had been avoiding. They had lost. The war was over. All that remained was deciding how they would die. He gathered his surviving followers. Perhaps 50 remained, out of the 200 who had started this war. They were exhausted, wounded. Many were so deeply corrupted by the dark side, they barely resembled the Jedi they had once been. So Exan stood beside him, loyal to the end, despite everything. Karnas Moore, Sorzu Singh, Remulus Draper, the architects of atrocity, the pioneers of power. Pall gave them a choice. They could make a final stand, fight until every last one of them was dead, taking as many Jedi with them as possible, or they could surrender and face the Council's judgment. The vote was unanimous. They would surrender because even corrupted by the dark side, even transformed into monsters, they still possessed enough of their former selves to recognize that more death served no purpose. The Jedi Council accepted their surrender, but made clear there would be no mercy. Execution was considered, seriously considered. The Council debated for days. Some masters argued that the Dark Jedi were too dangerous to be allowed to live. Others felt that executing surrendered prisoners violated the Jedi Code too fundamentally. The final decision was a compromise. Exile. The Dark Jedi would be stripped of their ranks, their property, their citizenship in the Republic. They would be given ships with minimal supplies and directed into the unknown regions, the vast uncharted territory beyond the Republic's borders. If they ever returned, they would be killed on sight. If they died in the wilderness, so be it. The Council washing its hands of them, sending them away to be someone else's problem or no one's problem at all. Ajunta Pall stood in the council chamber one final time, wearing shackles that suppressed his connection to the Force. The masters who had once celebrated his genius now looked at him with disgust and pity. Master Arca Jeth delivered the sentence. You are cast out, Ajunta Pall. No longer Jedi, no longer welcome in civilized space. May the Force have mercy on your soul, for we cannot. They were given 3 days to prepare. 3 days to gather what supplies they could carry. 3 days to say goodbye to a galaxy they would never see again. On the morning of the 4th day, 17 ships departed from Coruscant, carrying the surviving Dark Jedi into exile. They jumped to hyperspace along a trajectory that would take them far beyond known space. The Jedi watched them go and hoped they would never be heard from again. It was a hope that would be bitterly disappointed. As Ajunta Pall's ship vanished into the stars, he felt something he had not felt in decades. Not quite regret, not quite hope, something in between. The war was over. They had lost everything, but they were still alive. And in the unknown regions, in the darkness beyond the maps, new possibilities awaited. The first month in the unknown regions nearly destroyed them. 17 ships had departed Coruscant, carrying just over 100 Dark Jedi survivors. By the time they found Korriban, only 13 ships remained. The others had been lost to hyperspace miscalculations, mechanical failures, or in one case, a mutiny that ended with the entire crew spacing each other in a rage-fueled bloodbath. The exile fleet had no destination. The Jedi Council had simply pointed them toward the galactic rim and told them to keep flying. Their Navi computers contained no charts for the regions they were entering. Every hyperspace jump was a gamble, a blind leap into the unknown, with no guarantee there would be a stable route or even a star system on the other side. They wandered through the void like ghosts, jumping from system to system, searching for anything that might sustain them. Most worlds they found were barren rocks or gas giants. Others were habitable, but already occupied by hostile species who attacked on sight. They landed on one promising world only to discover its atmosphere contained a spore that induced violent madness. 3 Dark Jedi died before they could evacuate. Supplies dwindled. Food ran low. Water recyclers began failing. Arguments erupted constantly, sometimes escalating into duels. The dark side, which had made them powerful, now made them volatile. Every insult felt like a mortal offense. Every disagreement became a power struggle. Ajunta Pall held them together through sheer force of personality. When 2 Dark Jedi drew lightsabers on each other over ration distribution, Pall disarmed them both with a gesture and reminded them in a voice that brooked no argument that they were all each other had left. When despair threatened to overwhelm the group, he spoke of possibilities ahead, of worlds waiting to be claimed, of a future where they would no longer be fugitives but founders of something new. But privately, in his quarters at night, Paul wondered if he had led them all to a slow death in the darkness between stars. Oxaxan found him there one evening, staring out at the hyperspace tunnel flowing past the viewport. She said nothing at first, simply stood beside him in companionable silence. They had known each other for over a century now, had fought together, bled together, lost everything together. "Do you ever regret it?" she finally asked. Paul considered the question carefully. Regret was a luxury they could not afford. Regret meant accepting they had been wrong, and if they had been wrong, then the war, the deaths, the destruction, all of it had been for nothing. "No," he said. "But I wish it had ended differently." 2 months into their exile, sensors detected something unusual, a region of space that seemed to resist their scans, an area of the unknown regions that was somehow even more unknown. The stellar cartography was all wrong, ancient, as if this sector had been deliberately hidden from the rest of the galaxy. Paul ordered the fleet to investigate. They emerged from hyperspace in a system unlike anything they had encountered. The stars themselves seemed older here, their light tinged with red, and ahead of them, a cluster of worlds orbited close together, unusually dense, as if some ancient force had pulled them into proximity. The 4th planet from the sun radiated power, not heat, not radiation, but something else, something they could feel, even from orbit. The force was strong here, incredibly strong, and it tasted of darkness. Scans revealed the planet was inhabited. Primitive settlements dotted the surface, stone structures, simple agriculture. But there was something else, something the sensors struggled to quantify, an energy field that permeated the entire world, similar to a force nexus but far more pervasive. Paul made the decision they would land. The planet's surface was like nothing they had seen before. Red. Everything was red. The sand was red. The rocks were red. Even the sky during the day held a crimson tint that made it feel like the entire world was bleeding. Twin suns hung overhead, smaller and older than the ones they were accustomed to, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. They set down in what appeared to be a valley, a natural formation surrounded by steep cliffs and ancient rock formations. As the ship's ramps lowered and they stepped onto alien soil for the first time, Ajunta Pall felt the planet's dark side energy wash over him like a warm bath. This place resonated with them, called to them. They had been on the surface less than an hour when the natives appeared. At first, Pall thought they were seeing more Dark Jedi. So similar was their appearance to what he and his followers had become. Red skin, bone spurs protruding from their faces, yellow eyes. But these were not corrupted Force users. This was their natural state, an entire species that looked like darkness incarnate. The natives approached cautiously, a group of perhaps 20 warriors carrying primitive weapons, blades made from sharpened bone, spears tipped with obsidian. They wore minimal clothing, their muscular bodies covered in ritual scarring and tattoos. As they drew closer, Pall realized they were not preparing to attack. They were preparing to worship. The lead warrior, an older male with extensive scarification, dropped to his knees before Pall. The others followed suit. And then, in a language Pall did not recognize, but somehow understood through the Force, the warrior spoke. Gods, the gods have come. The Sith species, as Pall would learn they were called, had legends, ancient prophecies passed down through generations about beings of immense power who would descend from the sky and lead them to greatness. They had been waiting for centuries, and when the Dark Jedi arrived, crimson blades igniting and the Force swirling around them like visible flame, the Sith saw their prophecies fulfilled. Pall could have corrected them, could have explained they were simply exiles, refugees fleeing a war they had lost. But as he looked at the kneeling warriors, at the awe and reverence in their yellow eyes, a different possibility crystallized in his mind. They had lost everything in the known galaxy, their ranks, their home, their purpose. But here, in this forgotten corner of space, they could become something new, not refugees, not exiles, gods. Over the following weeks, the Dark Jedi explored their new home. The planet was called Korriban by its native inhabitants. It was one of several Sith worlds in the region, part of what the locals called the Stygian caldera. Other planets included Zeost, a frozen world with vast cities carved from ice; Relg, a planet shrouded in constant storms; Shudos, where the Sith mined precious minerals from deep caverns. The Sith species numbered in the hundreds of thousands across these worlds. They were tribal, primitive by Republic standards, but far from savage. They had a complex social structure ruled by kings and priests. They practiced their own crude form of Force manipulation, calling it sorcery, using it primarily for ritual purposes and warfare. They had writing, art, oral histories stretching back millennia. And they were desperate for guidance. The Sith species had been locked in constant tribal warfare for generations. Different kings claimed different territories. Priests competed for followers. Blood feuds stretched back centuries. Their society was on the edge of collapse, tearing itself apart from within. The arrival of the Dark Jedi changed everything. Ajunta Pall called a gathering of his followers. All 100 survivors assembled in their makeshift camp in the Valley of Gold. He laid out his vision. They could not return to the Republic. That bridge had been burned beyond repair. But here they had an opportunity, a species that revered them, worlds rich in resources, and most importantly, complete freedom to study and practice the Force without restriction. They would not merely settle here, they would rule. Each of them would claim territory, establish themselves as lords over Sith populations. They would create a new civilization, one built on their principles, power, strength, mastery of the Force in all its aspects. They would take what they had learned from the Jedi and the dark side and fuse it with Sith sorcery to create something unprecedented. An empire. The vote was unanimous. Ajunta Pall declared himself Dark Lord of the Sith, the first being in galactic history to bear that title. The name itself was a statement of purpose. They were no longer Dark Jedi, rebels against an order. They were something new, something that had never existed before. The other leaders took similar titles. Nexo became a Sith Lord, as did Karnus Mor, Sorzu Sin, and Remulus Drapar. They divided the Sith territories among themselves. Paul claimed Korriban, the spiritual heart of Sith civilization. Nexo took Zorzust, Mor claimed Korriban, Sin settled on Relg, Drapar established himself on a smaller world called Kolzunor. The transformation of Sith society began immediately. Paul's first act was to challenge the existing Sith king to ritual combat. The king, a warrior named Dathka, who had ruled the Korriban territories for 30 years, accepted. He had no choice. To refuse would mean losing all authority. The duel lasted less than a minute. Dathka was a formidable warrior by Sith standards, strong in their crude Force abilities, skilled with the massive war blade he carried. But against a Jedi Master who had fought in the 100-year darkness, he stood no chance. Paul moved like liquid shadow, his lightsaber humming as it carved through Dathka's defenses and removed his head from his shoulders in a single elegant strike. The watching Sith warriors roared their approval. The old king was dead. The new god had proven his strength. Ajunta Pall was now king of Korriban. Similar challenges occurred across the Sith worlds, each Dark Jedi establishing dominance through demonstration of overwhelming power. The Sith species, who respected strength above all else, accepted these new rulers without question. In their eyes, beings who could wield the Force with such mastery were clearly superior, divine. But the Dark Jedi offered more than just power. They offered knowledge. Paul established the first schools, teaching Sith warriors advanced Force techniques, lightsaber combat forms that made their traditional blade work obsolete, meditation practices that deepened connection to the Force. The Sith proved to be remarkably adept students. Their natural attunement to the dark side, combined with Jedi training methods, created warriors of devastating efficiency. And in return, the Sith taught their new lords the secrets of their ancient sorcery, alchemical processes that could twist flesh and bone, rituals that could imbue objects with Force energy, ways to bind spirits to physical locations, dark side techniques that even the Dark Jedi had never imagined. It was a synthesis. Jedi discipline meets Sith savagery. Advanced technology meets ancient mysticism. The result was something that transcended both parent cultures. Construction began across Korriban. Massive temples rising from the Red Desert, built by thousands of Sith workers under Dark Jedi supervision. The Valley of the Dark Lords was established, a sacred site where the greatest Sith would eventually be entombed. Palaces, training academies, meditation chambers carved deep into canyon walls. Ajunta Pall oversaw it all from his throne in the great temple at the heart of the primary Sith city. He no longer looked remotely human. The dark side corruption that had begun during the war had accelerated on Korriban, fed by the planet's pervasive dark side nexus. His skin had become pale as bone. His eyes burned like molten gold. Veins of darkness seemed to pulse beneath his flesh. He had become something beyond mortal, something terrifying, something magnificent. At night, he would stand on his temple's highest balcony and look up at the alien stars. Somewhere, out there beyond the darkness, the Republic continued. The Jedi Order prospered. They believed the Dark Jedi had vanished into obscurity, died in the unknown regions, became nothing more than a cautionary tale. They had no idea what was being built in the shadows. An empire founded on principles the Jedi had tried to suppress. An order of dark side wielders who rejected every limitation the Council had imposed. Ajunta Pall had led his followers into exile, expecting to find only death or obscurity. Instead, he had found a kingdom, a people who worshipped him as a god, and unlimited freedom to explore the Force without restriction or judgment. The galaxy had cast them out. They would return as conquerors. The Sith Empire took shape over the course of a generation, transforming from scattered tribes into a unified civilization that would have been unrecognizable to the primitives who had first knelt before the Dark Jedi. Ajunta Pall ruled from Korriban, but his influence extended across every Sith world. He had become more than a king. The Sith species referred to him as Jedi, the Dark Lord, a title that carried religious weight. Temples across multiple planets bore his image carved in stone, depicting him as a being of terrible majesty wreathed in power. The reality was not far from the depiction. By now Pall had spent decades immersed in Korriban's dark side nexus, studying Sith sorcery, pushing his abilities far beyond what he had achieved during the 100-year darkness. He could kill with a thought, could sense life across vast distances, could manipulate matter at the molecular level, reshaping reality through will alone. His presence in the Force was so overwhelming that weaker beings would faint in his proximity, their minds unable to process the sheer weight of power he radiated. But godhood came with complications. The other Dark Jedi Lords, while acknowledging Pall's supremacy, constantly jockeyed for position beneath him. Karnas Mur had established a power base on Chadors, amassing wealth from the planet's mineral exports and building a private army of Sith warriors loyal only to him. Sorzu Sin's experiments on Relg had produced increasingly disturbing results, creatures that blurred the line between animal and abomination, some of which had escaped her control and now terrorized the countryside. Remulus Draper, perhaps the most brilliant and unstable of them all, had delved so deeply into Sith alchemy that he barely resembled anything human anymore. His body had been altered through his own experiments, incorporating elements from various species, giving him abilities that defied natural law, but at the cost of his sanity. He claimed to hear voices in the Force, ancient Sith spirits offering him knowledge, though whether these were genuine or hallucinations was unclear. Only Sogzan remained a stable ally, and even that relationship had grown complicated over the decades. She ruled Zeost with efficiency and cunning, transforming the frozen world into the administrative heart of the growing empire. Where Pall was the spiritual leader and Muir the ambitious rival, Joexan became the architect of infrastructure. She established trade routes between Sith worlds, created the first written legal codes, developed bureaucratic systems to manage populations that now numbered in the millions. They met regularly, Pall and Joexan, often alone in meditation chambers, where they could speak freely without the posturing required of their public roles. These conversations were the closest thing to genuine companionship either of them had known in decades. "Do you remember what we were?" she asked him once, her voice carrying a weight of accumulated years. "Every day," Pall replied. They sat in silence, two beings who had once been idealistic Jedi, now transformed into something the Order would have hunted as monsters. The tragedy was not that they had changed, but that they could remember who they had been clearly enough to understand what they had lost. Yet neither would undo their choices. The power was too intoxicating, the freedom too absolute, and the alternative, returning to the Republic to face execution, was not an option. The synthesis of Jedi knowledge and Sith sorcery produced innovations that reshaped their understanding of the Force entirely. Pall spent years developing what would later be called Sith alchemy to its highest art. He could take base metals and transmute them into substances that amplified Force abilities, could alter living tissue to make warriors stronger, faster, more resilient. His greatest achievement in this field was the creation of the first generation of Sith war beasts, creatures bred and modified specifically for combat, combining the ferocity of Korriban's native predators with enhanced intelligence and dark side augmentation. But his true passion lay in preserving knowledge. The Jedi had hoarded information, keeping it locked away in restricted archives. Pall was determined that Sith wisdom would not suffer the same fate. He pioneered the creation of Sith holocrons, pyramid-shaped crystalline matrices that could store not just information but personality imprints of their creators. These devices were far more sophisticated than anything the Jedi had developed, capable of interactive teaching, adapting lessons to individual students, preserving the creator's essence with such fidelity that consulting a holocron was almost like speaking with the living person. Pall's personal holocron took him 5 years to create. He poured his knowledge into it, his philosophies, his techniques, his warnings, every meditation, every battle, every mistake he had made, all of it preserved in crystalline memory. When it was complete, activating the holocron produced a miniature version of himself, rendered in red light, capable of answering questions and providing instruction as if Pall himself were present. It was a form of immortality, he realized, not of body, but of mind and knowledge. Long after his flesh had rotted to dust, this holocron would continue teaching, shaping future generations of Sith. The idea pleased him immensely. His other great work was the sword. Every Sith Lord carried a lightsaber, the weapon of their Jedi past, but Pall wanted something more symbolic, something that represented the fusion of old and new. He commissioned the greatest Sith weaponsmiths to forge a blade of traditional design, a massive two-handed sword of the type Sith kings had wielded for generations. Then, over the course of months, he subjected it to alchemical processes that transformed it from simple metal into something far more sinister. The blade was infused with dark side energy until it glowed with a sickly luminescence. It could cut through materials that would shatter normal weapons. More importantly, it was bound to Pall himself, resonating with his presence in the Force, becoming an extension of his will. The sword corrupted anyone else who touched it, filling their minds with visions of violence and domination, driving them toward madness. It was a weapon and a curse, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Pall kept it at his side constantly, a symbol of his power and a warning to any who might challenge his authority. Training the next generation of Sith became a central focus of the Empire's development. The Dark Jedi were aging, their numbers finite. If the Sith civilization were to endure, they needed successors. The academies established across multiple worlds accepted only the most Force-sensitive children. Testing was brutal. Candidates underwent trials that would have horrified the Jedi, challenges designed to break the weak and forge the strong into weapons. Many died during training. Those who survived emerged as Sith warriors of devastating capability, skilled in both lightsaber combat and dark side sorcery. But there was a problem. The pure-blooded Sith, while naturally attuned to the dark side, lacked the raw Force potential of the Dark Jedi themselves. None of the native Sith could match even the weakest of the original exiles in power. They were formidable by any normal standard, but fell short of the godlike abilities their masters possessed. Swordshu Sin proposed a solution: selective breeding between the Dark Jedi and the Sith species. The idea was controversial. Some of the Dark Jedi found the notion distasteful, unwilling to produce offspring with beings they considered primitives despite decades of cultural development. Others saw the strategic value. Hybrids might combine the best traits of both species, the Force sensitivity of the Dark Jedi with the natural dark side attunement of the Sith. Pall approved the program over objections. Within a generation, the first Sith purebloods were born, children of mixed heritage who displayed remarkable abilities. They were fewer in number than either parent species, but represented the future. Paul envisioned a new race that would carry forward both bloodlines. The politics of the Sith Empire grew increasingly complex as the years accumulated. What had begun as a simple hierarchy with Pall at the apex evolved into a web of alliances, rivalries, and barely restrained violence. Carnus Muir made his play for power in the Empire's fourth decade. He had been gathering support quietly, promising other Sith Lords greater autonomy if they backed his claim to supremacy. When he finally challenged Pall openly, he did so with nearly a third of the Empire's warriors at his back. The confrontation occurred on neutral ground, a barren plateau on one of Korriban's moons. Both sides assembled their forces, thousands of warriors on each side, the largest gathering of Sith military power since the Empire's founding. Mu stood at the head of his army, confident in his numbers and the amulets he had created to enhance his abilities. Ajunta Pall arrived alone. He walked across the empty ground between the armies, his twisted sword slung across his back, his movements unhurried. When he reached the center point, he stopped and called out to Muir. "You may have forgotten what I am capable of. Allow me to remind you." What followed was not a duel. It was a demonstration. Pall did not draw his sword. He simply raised one hand, and lightning erupted from his fingertips. Not the relatively weak force lightning merger and the others could produce, but a storm of electrical fury that arced across the entire opposing army. Hundreds fell screaming, their bodies charred, their nervous systems fried. Those who survived the initial blast found themselves paralyzed, muscles locked, unable to move or fight. Muir attempted to rally his forces to mount some kind of defense. Pall gestured almost casually, and Muir was lifted from his feet by invisible hands, dragged through the air until he hung suspended directly in front of Pall. The Dark Lord reached out and placed one hand on Muir's chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Muir began to scream. Pall was draining his life force, pulling the energy directly from his body, aging him decades in seconds. Muir's skin withered. His hair whitened and fell out, his muscles atrophied. By the time Pall released him, Muir was a dried husk, barely alive, reduced from a powerful Sith Lord to something barely recognizable as sentient. Pall turned to address the assembled warriors, his voice carrying across the battlefield without apparent effort. "I am the Dark Lord of the Sith. My word is law. My will is absolute. Challenge me, and this is your fate. Serve me, and you will share in power beyond imagination. Choose." The choice was unanimous. Muir's supporters abandoned him immediately, pledging loyalty to Pall. The broken Sith Lord was left where he lay, a warning to any who might harbor similar ambitions. He lived for another decade, a shadow of his former self, before finally dying in obscurity. After that, there were no more open challenges to Pall's authority. But the incident left scars on the Empire's psyche. The Sith had learned that their civilization was built not on principles or shared vision, but on the overwhelming power of one being. When Pall eventually died, chaos would follow. They all knew it. They simply chose not to speak of it. The Xian understood the danger better than most. She approached Pall privately after the incident with Ma, expressing concern about succession and stability. Pall dismissed her worries with a wave of his hand. "When I die, the strongest will rule. That is as it should be. That is the Sith way. And if the Empire tears itself apart in the struggle," she asked, "then it was not strong enough to survive. Better it dies than persists in weakness." It was the philosophy that would define Sith civilization for millennia. Survival of the strongest, power above all. Let the weak perish. It was brutal, uncompromising, and utterly consistent with everything the dark side represented. Decades turned into generations. The original Dark Jedi aged, their bodies maintained beyond natural limits through Sith alchemy and dark side powers, but still inevitably declining. One by one, the others died. Remulus Drapar, lost to his experiments, consumed by an alchemical creation of his own design. Sorzu Sine, assassinated by a student who surpassed her, proving the very principles she had taught. Agzogzan endured the longest beside Pall, the last of the original exiles still standing. They had been companions for over a century, the only beings alive who remembered the Jedi Temple, the Republic, the galaxy before the Sith Empire. When she finally felt death approaching, she came to Pall one last time. They sat together in silence, two ancient beings at the end of impossibly long lives, watching Korriban's twin suns set over the red desert. Was it worth it, she asked. The same question from a lifetime ago. Pall's answer had changed. I built an empire. I became a god. I achieved power beyond anything the Jedi could imagine. And I am more empty now than I was as a Padawan, struggling with basic meditation. Then why continue? Soagzan asked. Because I no longer know how to do anything else. She died that night, peacefully in her sleep, one of the few Sith Lords to pass without violence. Pall oversaw her burial personally, ensuring she was interred with full honors in the Valley of the Dark Lords. He stood at her tomb long after the ceremony ended, remembering the young Jedi who had found him in the restricted archives all those lifetimes ago. He was alone now, the last of his generation, surrounded by students and servants and warriors who revered him, but utterly, completely alone. The empire he had built would outlive him by millennia. The philosophy he had created would shape galactic history for ages to come. But in that moment, standing at his oldest friend's grave under alien stars, Ajunta Pall felt nothing but the cold emptiness that the dark side always delivered in the end. The Sith Empire reached its zenith during the final decades of Ajunta Pall's life, a civilization spanning multiple star systems with millions of subjects, all unified under the banner of dark side philosophy. Korriban remained the spiritual center, but the Empire's reach extended far beyond that single red world. Zeusut had become a thriving metropolis of ice palaces and administrative centers. Tradadas produced minerals that fueled the Empire's economy. Relg served as a testing ground for increasingly sophisticated alchemical experiments, and dozens of smaller worlds contributed resources, population, and worship to the growing power. Trade routes connected these worlds, massive cargo vessels moving between systems carrying goods and people. The Sith had reverse-engineered and improved upon the Republic technology the Dark Jedi had brought with them, creating ships that were faster, weapons that were deadlier, systems that ran on dark side energy matrices that would have been impossible in Republic space. But technology was only part of the Empire's strength. The true foundation was the Force itself, wielded with a sophistication and power that made the Jedi Order's teachings seem like children playing with matches. Ajunta Pall had spent his entire adult life studying the Force, first as a Jedi, then as a Dark Jedi, and finally as a Sith Lord with unlimited resources and subjects. His understanding had evolved to levels that bordered on the metaphysical. He could perceive connections between living things that others could not sense, could manipulate those connections like a musician playing an instrument. He developed techniques that future generations of Sith would study for millennia. Battle meditation refined to such precision that he could coordinate thousands of warriors simultaneously, making an army move as one organism. Life-draining abilities that could pull the essence from an entire battlefield, leaving corpses in his wake while he grew stronger. Force lightning that could arc between targets with apparent intelligence, seeking out and destroying anything he designated as an enemy. But his most significant contribution was theoretical rather than practical. Pall spent years meditating on the nature of the Force itself, questioning the fundamental assumptions both Jedi and Sith had operated under. The Jedi viewed the Force as something external, a cosmic energy field that Force users could access but not truly control. The Sith species treated it as something mystical, a gift from their gods that could be invoked through ritual. Pall proposed something different. What if the Force was not external at all, but internal? What if consciousness itself was the source, and the Force was simply the medium through which sufficiently powerful wills could reshape reality? Under this framework, the dark side was not corruption but liberation, the removal of artificial limitations that prevented beings from exercising their full potential. It was a philosophy that justified everything the Sith had become. Power was not something to be feared or restricted, but celebrated and pursued. The strong deserved to rule, because strength itself was the ultimate virtue. Compassion was weakness, because it prioritized the inferior over the superior. Peace was stagnation, because conflict drove evolution. These ideas were codified in teachings that spread throughout the Sith academies. Young students absorbed them as fundamental truths, building their entire worldview on principles Pall had articulated. The philosophy would endure long after its creator had turned to dust, shaping Sith civilization across the ages. But philosophy, however elegant, could not address the fundamental problem facing Pall as he entered what even his extended lifespan recognized as old age. He was going to die, and when he died, succession would be decided through bloodshed. He had no children. None of the original Dark Jedi had produced offspring with each other, and by the time the hybrid breeding program had begun, Pall was already too old and too corrupted by the dark side to participate. There was no heir, no clear successor, no mechanism for peaceful transition of power. The Sith Lords beneath him, the students who had risen to prominence through talent and ruthlessness, were already positioning themselves for the inevitable power struggle. Pall could sense it in their interactions, the careful alliances being formed, the weapons being stockpiled, the loyal warriors being cultivated. When he died, the Empire would tear itself apart, unless he could find a way to prevent his own death. The obsession with immortality consumed Pall's final decades. He threw himself into research with the same intensity he had once devoted to Jedi studies, exploring every avenue, testing every theory, regardless of how dangerous or unethical. Essence transfer was the most promising technique. The idea was simple in concept, but staggeringly complex in execution. At the moment of death, transfer your consciousness, your very essence, into a new body, a younger body. Continue living indefinitely by jumping from vessel to vessel. The practical challenges were immense. The technique required perfect timing, absolute focus at the moment of death, and a suitable host body prepared and willing, or at least unable to resist. Pall conducted experiments on prisoners, attempting to force his consciousness into their bodies. The results were uniformly catastrophic. Bodies rejected the foreign essence, dying within hours or days. Consciousness is fragmented, leaving the host insane. In one particularly gruesome case, both the original personality and Pall's transferred fragment remained aware, trapped together in one body, each fighting for control until the host's brain simply shut down from the strain. After dozens of failed attempts, Pall concluded that essence transfer, while theoretically possible, was beyond his current understanding. Perhaps future generations would succeed where he had failed. Life extension through alchemy offered another path. Pall had already prolonged his life decades beyond natural limits through dark side augmentation, but there were theoretical maximums beyond which the body simply could not be pushed. He experimented with combining his own DNA with that of species known for longevity, attempting to grant himself their extended lifespans. The procedures were agonizing and produced minimal results. He gained perhaps another decade, maybe two, but at the cost of further physical corruption. By his final years, Pall barely resembled anything organic. His skin had become translucent in places, revealing twisted musculature and bone beneath. His eyes burned with constant fire that never dimmed. His voice had taken on harmonics that made listeners uncomfortable, as if multiple beings were speaking simultaneously. He had become a living embodiment of the dark side, powerful beyond measure, but paying the price in every fiber of his deteriorating body. Spirit binding offered a different approach to immortality. Rather than preserving the body or transferring to a new one, bind your consciousness to a physical location. Become a ghost, aware and able to interact but no longer limited by flesh. Pall found this option more philosophically acceptable than the others. He would die, yes, but death would not be the end. His spirit would linger, watching over the empire he had built, offering guidance to future generations. In a way, it was more appropriate than continuing to live in flesh. He would become myth, legend, an eternal presence in the Valley of the Dark Lords. He began preparations for his tomb while still very much alive, directing its construction with meticulous attention to detail. The location was chosen carefully, a site in the valley where the dark side nexus was particularly strong, where reality felt thin and malleable. The structure would be massive, befitting the first Dark Lord, with multiple chambers and passages designed to both protect and display his legacy. The main burial chamber was circular, its walls carved with scenes from Pall's life. His early days as a Jedi Master, depicted with a mixture of nostalgia and contempt. The 100-year darkness, battles rendered in stone with brutal honesty. The arrival on Korriban and his ascension to godhood, his greatest achievements in alchemy and sorcery, all of it preserved in permanent record. 3 sarcophagi were placed in the chamber, a decision that confused his architects until Pall explained. By the time of his death, he might not remember which body was truly his. The dark side corruption, the years of life extension, the constant manipulation of his own biology through alchemy, all of it had left him uncertain of his own physical continuity. Better to have multiple resting places. Let future generations puzzle over which contained the true remains of Ajunta Pall. Treasures were assembled to accompany him into death. Holocrons containing accumulated wisdom, Sith amulets and talismans he had created over the decades. Ancient texts he had collected from across Sith space, and prominently displayed, his twisted sword, the weapon that had become synonymous with his reign, mounted on the wall above the central sarcophagus. The tomb was fortified with every defensive measure Sith technology and sorcery could provide. Physical traps that would kill unwary intruders, alchemical wards that corrupted the minds of those who entered without permission, dark side energy fields that drained life from the living, and most insidiously, psychological defenses that attacked the deepest fears and doubts of anyone foolish enough to penetrate the inner chambers. It was a tomb designed to preserve Pall's legacy and punish those who would disturb it. A final statement of power from a being who had defined an age. But all the preparations, all the defenses, all the attempts to cheat death through sorcery and technology could not address the fundamental emptiness that had grown in Pall's spirit over the decades. He would sit alone in his throne room late at night, when the palace was silent, and even his most devoted servants slept. The throne itself was a masterwork, carved from a single piece of obsidian and inlaid with precious metals, raised on a dais so that he looked down upon all who approached. It was designed to inspire awe and terror in equal measure. But sitting there in the darkness, Pall felt neither awe nor terror. He felt nothing. He had achieved everything he had ever wanted, and things he had never imagined possible. He had gone from Jedi Master to Dark Lord. From exile to God, he commanded an empire. His word was absolute law. His power was unmatched. Future generations would study his techniques and philosophy for millennia. And none of it mattered. The dark side had promised him freedom, power, knowledge without restriction. It had delivered on every promise, but it had never mentioned the cost, the slow erosion of everything that made existence meaningful, the transformation of emotions into mere tools stripped of genuine feeling, the inability to connect with another being on any level deeper than master and servant, predator and prey. He remembered being a Jedi, remembered the satisfaction of helping others, the warmth of genuine friendship, the simple pleasure of mastering a difficult technique through discipline and practice. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a different person who had worn his body before the dark side had consumed everything. Tuogzan had understood, at least partially. That was why her death had affected him more than he had expected. She had been the last connection to who he had been before, the only being who could look at him and see not the Dark Lord, but simply Ajunta Pall, a man who had made choices and lived with their consequences. Now she was gone, and he was surrounded by beings who worshipped or feared him, but could never truly know him. On particularly difficult nights, Pall would access his own holocron, the one he had created decades earlier. He would activate it and watch the miniature version of himself appear, rendered in red light, and he would have conversations with his younger self, asking questions, receiving answers based on who he had been when he created it. The differences between past and present Pall were striking. The holocron version was still idealistic in some ways, still believed the Sith Empire represented a genuine improvement over the Jedi Order's restrictions, still thought power and knowledge were ends in themselves, intrinsically valuable regardless of what you did with them. Present Pall knew better. Power was not an end. It was a trap. Knowledge was not liberation. It was a burden. And the Sith Empire, for all its achievements, was built on principles that guaranteed it would eventually destroy itself. But he could not undo what had been done, could not return to being the Jedi he had once been. That path was closed forever, burned away by decades of dark side immersion. All he could do was continue forward until his body finally failed, and death claimed him despite all his efforts to prevent it. The Sith Lords beneath him sensed his deterioration, though they dared not speak of it openly. They began preparing more overtly for succession, their alliances becoming less subtle, their preparations more obvious. Pall allowed it. Let them scheme, let them prepare. When he was gone, they would fight, and the strongest would emerge victorious. That was the Sith way. That was what he had built. He remembered a conversation with Tuogzan years ago, when they had both still been relatively young by extended standards. She had asked what he hoped the Sith Empire would become. A civilization where the strong prosper and the weak serve, he had answered, where power is pursued without apology or limitation, where the Force is studied completely, not restricted by fear. And what happens to compassion? She had asked. To mercy, to love. Those are luxuries the powerful can afford but do not require, he had said. Looking back now, Pall recognized that answer for what it was, a justification, a rationalization for abandoning everything that made civilization worthwhile in favor of pure power. The Sith Empire was strong, yes, powerful, certainly, but it was also hollow, built on domination rather than cooperation, on fear rather than respect, on might making right rather than any genuine sense of justice or morality. It would not last. How could it? Civilizations built on such foundations always collapsed. Eventually, the only question was when and how catastrophically. But that would be a problem for future generations. Pall's time was ending. His body was failing, despite all attempts to preserve it. Death approached with the inevitability of a setting sun, and for the first time in decades, he found himself almost welcoming it. Perhaps death would bring what life could not, peace, an end to the endless hunger that the dark side had instilled in him, release from the burden of godhood. Or perhaps death would bring nothing at all, simply cessation, an ending as empty as the existence that preceded it. Either way, Ajunta Pall was ready to find out. The fear began as a whisper, a trembling hand while grasping his lightsaber. Climbing palace steps left him winded. The mirror showed not a god but a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead. Death was coming, and all his power could not stop it. Paul threw himself into research with desperate intensity. His laboratory became a charnel house of failed experiments. Prisoners from across the Empire subjected to procedures that defied morality. He was searching for immortality, and no price was too high. Essence transfer remained the most promising technique. Separate consciousness from body, transfer to a new vessel, live forever in succession of younger forms. Ancient Sith texts described spirits who had attempted it millennia ago, achieving partial success but bound to locations or objects. His first attempt was breakthrough and nightmare combined. A young Sith warrior, drugged unconscious, brought to the laboratory. Paul forced a fragment of his consciousness into the warrior's sleeping mind. For one glorious moment, he existed in two places simultaneously, seeing through both sets of eyes, feeling two heartbeats. Then the warrior's body began seizing violently. Two consciousnesses fighting for control of one brain. Blood poured from his nose, ears, eyes. Neural tissue tearing itself apart. The warrior died within minutes, brain reduced to non-functional tissue. The fragment of Paul trapped inside experienced death, second-hand, a preview of what awaited him. He was violently ill for hours afterward, but he did not stop. Dozens more prisoners cycled through over following months. Different species, ages, force potentials. Some died immediately. Others survived days in confused agony, minds shattered by foreign consciousness. The closest success was a non-force-sensitive human. Paul maintained connection for 3 days before it dissolved. The subject clawed his own eyes out afterward, rather than endure the violation. A sense transfer was beyond his current capabilities. Cloning offered theoretical solution, but Sith techniques were primitive. Clones survived weeks before cellular degradation, and even with stable clone, transfer problem remained unsolved. Cybernetic enhancement was attempted next. Replace failing organic components with mechanical ones. His left arm replaced from elbow down, when original withered, spine reinforced with durasteel. When vertebrae crumbled, internal organs supplemented with mechanical pumps. The enhancements kept him functional, but reduced force connection. Metal did not conduct the force like living tissue, trading longevity for the abilities that made him worth keeping alive. He abandoned the approach after force sensitivity dropped noticeably. The most disturbing experiments involved merging with other beings entirely. Fusion, not transfer, becoming composite entity, combining multiple consciousnesses. Bodies tried growing together, flesh melting in impossible configurations, minds fragmenting into schizophrenic chaos, creatures begging for death in multiple voices. One fusion survived nearly a month. 2 Sith warriors merged into single organism with 2 heads, 4 arms, consciousness, unable to decide if it was one being or 2. It took its own life eventually, both heads coordinating to drive blade through shared heart. As physical condition deteriorated, research took increasingly desperate directions. Consuming life force of force sensitives, wholesale provided temporary boosts, hours of renewed vigor, but effect always faded. Sith poisons promising extended life delivered only agonizing side effects. Ancient rituals requiring astronomical alignments and sacrifices failed completely. Every failure brought him closer to unavoidable truth. Death could be delayed but not prevented. The realization brought rage. Paul destroyed entire palace sections, force lightning arcing wildly, crushing stone and metal, screaming defiance at universe itself. Servants learned to evacuate when episodes began. Those too slow did not survive. Between rage came depression so profound he would remain motionless for days, sitting on throne, staring at nothing. Eventually he would stir, resume research, continue futile quest. During one depressive episode, a Sith Lord named Korriban entered uninvited. "My lord, you are dying," Korriban stated bluntly. Paul focused on the younger Sith, noting confidence in his stance, calculation in eyes, a rival assessing weakness. "I came to offer perspective," Korriban continued. "You have lived centuries, built empire, achieved immortality of different kind. Your teachings will outlive flesh. Legacy is secure. Why torture yourself pursuing what may be impossible?" "Because I am not ready to die," Paul said simply. "With respect, my lord, no one is ever ready. Death comes regardless. Question is how we face it, as gods or as frightened creatures clinging to existence." The word struck deeper than intended. Paul saw himself through Korriban's eyes, a being once magnificent, now reduced to withered thing frantically grasping for more life. Pathetic, undignified. Everything Sith philosophy claimed to reject. "Get out," Paul said quietly. The conversation marked turning point. If he could not prevent death, perhaps he could shape what came after. Spirit binding, remaining aware after death, anchored to physical location, a ghost with awareness, was still existence. Better than oblivion. He studied spirit binding techniques obsessively. At moment of death, anchor consciousness to place sufficiently strong in force to support it indefinitely. His tomb was obvious choice. Valley of Dark Lord's location, where dark side energy pooled naturally, enhanced by rituals already established. Paul commissioned additional tomb work, specific architectural elements facilitating spirit binding, crystal matrices holding consciousness, meditation chambers where veil between physical and spiritual was deliberately thinned, alchemical wards preventing spirit from being banished or destroyed. He practiced using lesser spirits, ghosts of dead Sith. He could summon and attempt binding to objects. Success rate was poor. Most dissolved before binding established. Those succeeding were often incoherent personalities, fragmented by death trauma. But Paul learned from each attempt, refining understanding, preparing for moment when he would perform technique on himself. His body continued failing. Trembling became constant. Eyesight dimmed. Force connection remained strong, but channeling power through failing flesh grew increasingly difficult. He had months, at most, perhaps weeks. On nights when pain made sleep impossible, Paul walked through palace observing empire he had built, warriors training, administrators managing bureaucracy, scholars studying in libraries. All would continue after he was gone. His death would barely ripple surface of what he had created. The thought should have brought comfort. Instead, it highlighted his own insignificance. He had believed himself indispensable, cornerstone upon which empire rested. But empires did not need individuals. They needed systems, institutions, philosophies outliving any single person. He had created those. His role was complete. Ajunta Pall, first Dark Lord of the Sith, was no longer necessary to Sith Empire. The realization was more painful than physical deterioration. He had sacrificed everything, committed atrocities, transformed into monster, all pursuing power and knowledge. And in the end, it did not matter. He was just one being among billions, individual existence cosmically irrelevant despite all achieved. Darkseid had promised him significance. It delivered only awareness of his own insignificance dressed as godhood. In final weeks, Paul spent most time in his tomb, meditating in central chamber, practicing spirit binding technique, preparing for transition from life to whatever came after. 3 sarcophagi waited, empty and patient. He looked at them, and genuinely could not remember which he had designated as his own. Dark side corruption, alchemical modifications, centuries of existence had fragmented sense of self. He was no longer entirely sure which version of Ajunta Pall was real one. The Jedi Master? Dark Jedi warrior? God King? Desperate old being clinging to fading existence? Perhaps all of them. Perhaps none. Identity was less fixed than once believed. His twisted sword hung on wall above central sarcophagus. He called it through force. Weapon flew from mount, landed in palm, for moment holding that blade. Pall felt young again, powerful, greatest warrior of his generation. Then moment passed, and he was just old being entombed, holding symbol of life long since ended. He returned sword to its place, and resumed meditating. Death would come soon, and when it did, Ajunta Pall would be ready, or at least as ready as anyone could be. The tomb had taken 20 years to build, and would stand for 4,000 more. Every detail planned meticulously, location in Valley of Dark Lords positioned at convergence of natural dark side energy. Architects oriented structure to align with Korriban's twin suns at specific times, creating shadow patterns enhancing the force nexus. The entrance was monumental, carved into cliff face, flanked by statues depicting Pall in his prime. Not the withered creature he had become, but powerful Dark Lord of legend. Statues stood 10 meters tall, lightsaber and sword raised, eyes fixed on horizon with eternal vigilance. Approaching them, visitors felt weight, pressure from dark side saturating location. Beyond entrance, descending corridor stretched into mountain's heart, walls carved with Sith history scenes, arrival of dark Jedi, subjugation of Sith species, Empire establishment, all rendered in relief so detailed that in flickering torchlight, figures seemed to move, seemed to breathe. Walking that corridor was walking through time itself. Corridor terminated at massive door, solid durasteel reinforced with Sith alchemy, until harder than any known material. Opening required both physical strength and force ability. Behind lay treasure chamber. Holocrons occupied places of honor, dozens of them, each containing preserved knowledge. Pall's own holocron sat on pedestal at chamber center, larger than others, crystalline structure perfect. Activating it would summon miniature Pall, preserved as he had been in prime, ready to teach anyone deemed worthy. Weapons filled display cases, lightsabers taken from fallen Jedi during 100-year darkness, each a battle trophy. Sith swords imbued with dark side energy, amulets and talismans, objects of power that could enhance abilities or curse enemies. Some radiated such malevolence that placing them in proximity required careful calculation. Ancient texts occupied shelves carved into stone walls, protected by preservation wards, books and scrolls containing techniques, philosophies, histories existing nowhere else. Knowledge Jedi tried suppressing, Republic forbidden, that Pall spent lifetimes collecting. All here, available to those who could reach this chamber and survive its defenses. Because tomb was not merely treasure vault, it was gauntlet, final test, ensuring only truly powerful could claim what lay within. Traps filled structure, pressure plates, triggering ceiling collapses, hidden blades shooting from walls, poison gas released in certain chambers. These were simplest defenses, mechanical and predictable for anyone skilled enough to reach tomb in first place. The real defenses were alchemical and force-based. Certain corridors were saturated with dark side energy, so concentrated that walking through them induced madness in weak-minded. Visions of worst fears manifesting as hallucinations indistinguishable from reality. Many intruders never made it past these sections, dying of self-inflicted wounds while fighting phantoms only they could see. Ward stones placed at strategic points drained life force from living beings slowly at first, then accelerating. Spending too long in warded areas meant collapsing from exhaustion, body mummifying as essence was pulled into stones themselves. These wards would persist for millennia, powered by dark side nexus, claiming countless lives over centuries. The deepest chambers contained Pall's most sophisticated defenses, Sith spirits bound to specific locations, fragments of consciousness from dead Sith lords programmed to attack intruders. These spirits could manipulate force, creating telekinetic barriers, hurling objects, even attempting possession of particularly vulnerable victims. Central burial chamber, where 3 sarcophagi rested, had most elaborate protections. Anyone entering without proper knowledge faced immediate assault from all directions. Force lightning from crystal matrices embedded in walls, telekinetic pressure attempting to crush organs, psychic attacks targeting mind directly, attempting to shatter sanity. Only someone truly powerful, someone who understood Sith philosophy deeply, someone Pall would have considered worthy, could survive reaching innermost sanctum. The 3 sarcophagi dominated chamber, arranged in triangle formation around central point. Each identical, carved from single pieces of black stone, surfaces polished to mirror finish. Lid of each depicted Pall in repose, hands folded across chest, expression peaceful despite everything he had been. Why 3? Pall's architects had questioned this decision repeatedly. He gave different answers at different times, sometimes claiming it was symbolic, representing different aspects of his journey. Jedi, Dark Jedi, Sith Lord, 3 versions of same being. Other times he admitted darker truth. By time of his death, he might not remember which body was truly his. Dark side corruption, centuries of alchemical modification, essence transfer experiments that had partially succeeded, all had fragmented his sense of physical continuity. Better to prepare multiple resting places than risk spirit binding to wrong vessel. The twisted sword occupied place of honor, mounted on wall above central sarcophagus. Blade gleamed dully in perpetual twilight of burial chamber, still radiating malevolence centuries after its forging. Pall had decreed it must remain with him eternally, symbol of his reign, weapon that had carved empire from wilderness. Around chamber perimeter, smaller alcoves held personal items, robes he had worn as Jedi Master, carefully preserved, reminder of what he had been before fall. Datapad containing names of every dark Jedi who had followed him into exile, those who survived and those who died. Simple wooden cup he had used daily for decades, mundane object given significance by association. These personal touches made tomb more than monument. They made it mausoleum, final resting place of being who had been brilliant and flawed, powerful and broken, triumphant and ultimately tragic. Pall spent his final weeks living in tomb, preparing it and himself for transition. He meditated in burial chamber daily, practicing spirit binding technique until process became instinctive. At moment of death, his consciousness would need to act instantly, anchoring to location before dissipating into force. Hesitation meant oblivion. He recorded final messages, holocron recordings meant for future generations. Some were instructional, teaching techniques he had perfected over lifetime. Others were philosophical, reflecting on nature of power, cost of ambition, seduction of dark side, and some, recorded in moments of unusual honesty, were confessional. I built empire on principles I believed would create something greater than what came before. One recording stated, I rejected Jedi restrictions because I thought them cowardly, thought complete understanding of force required, exploring all aspects without limitation. I was not entirely wrong, but I was not right either. Dark side does offer power without restriction, but power without wisdom, without compassion, without anything but hunger for more power, creates only emptiness. I achieved everything I sought and lost everything that mattered in process. He paused in recording, ancient eyes staring into holocron sensor. Learn from my mistakes. Pursue knowledge, yes. Push boundaries, certainly. But do not lose yourself in pursuit. Remember who you were before power changed you. Hold on to something beyond ambition, or you will end as I have, surrounded by monuments to my greatness, completely alone. Recording ended. Paul sat in silence, wondering if anyone would ever hear those words, and if hearing them would make any difference. Probably not. Each generation believed itself immune to mistakes of previous ones. Each powerful being believed themselves different, special, exempt from consequences that claimed others. He had believed same thing once. Sith Lords came to pay respects during these final weeks, sensing their master's approaching end. They came individually or in small groups, offering awkward condolences, making transparent attempts to assess his condition and calculate when succession struggle would begin. Paul received them with cold courtesy, seeing through every pretense. They did not mourn him. They circled like scavengers waiting for corpse to stop moving. It was Sith way. He would have done same in their position, had done same, watching other dark Jedi die over decades. Only one visitor came without ulterior motive. A young Sith warrior, barely 20, who had studied in academy Paul established. She entered burial chamber hesitantly, clearly terrified but determined. "My lord," she said, voice shaking, "I came to thank you for everything you built, for knowledge you preserved. I know you are dying. I wanted you to know that what you created will endure." Paul studied her, sensing genuine gratitude beneath fear. In that moment, looking at student he had never personally taught, but who had benefited from systems he created, he felt something he had not experienced in decades. Pride, not in his power or achievements, but in legacy that would outlive him. This girl and thousands like her would carry forward what he had begun. Empire would survive his death. Knowledge would persist. He had created something bigger than himself. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Your words mean more than you know." She left, and Pal was alone again in his tomb. But aloneness felt different now, less like isolation and more like peace. His body was failing. Death approached. But in accepting rather than fighting it, he found measure of tranquility that had eluded him for centuries. He lay down in central sarcophagus, testing fit, preparing body for final rest. Stone was cold against his withered frame, uncomfortable, but that would not matter soon. He practiced spirit binding technique one final time, walking through mental steps, ensuring muscle memory, or whatever spiritual equivalent existed, would guide him when moment came. Everything was ready. Tomb prepared, defenses active, knowledge preserved, spirit binding technique perfected as much as possible. All that remained was waiting for end. Ajunta Pall closed his burning yellow eyes and let exhaustion take him into something resembling sleep. When he woke next, it would be for final time. Death came quietly in the hours before dawn. No dramatic final words. No gathering of devoted followers. Just Ajunta Pall, first Dark Lord of the Sith, alone in his burial chamber, feeling his ancient heart finally surrender after beating for centuries beyond its natural span. The pain had been constant companion for months, dull ache that occasionally flared into agony. But in those final moments, pain faded. Body simply stopped fighting, stopped maintaining processes that had kept him alive through will and alchemy and dark side power. Systems shut down one by one, cascade of failure spreading through withered frame. His last coherent thought was not of empire or power or legacy. It was simple, almost childlike. "I wonder what comes next." Then consciousness began fragmenting, dissolving into force like salt in water, and Pal, who had prepared for this moment through decades of study and practice, acted on instinct refined through countless rehearsals. He reached out with what remained of his awareness, grasping for anchor he had prepared. Tomb itself, saturated with dark side energy, crystal matrices positioned specifically for this purpose, wards designed to hold consciousness even after flesh failed. He poured himself into those anchors, binding spirit to location with everything he had left. For a moment he thought he had failed. Darkness, absolute, awareness scattering, sense of self dissolving into nothing. Then sudden violent snap, like rubber band pulled too far and released. He existed again, not in body. Body was dead weight in sarcophagus below him, but as something else. Spirit, ghost, consciousness without flesh. It worked. Ajunta Pall opened eyes he no longer possessed and saw burial chamber from new perspective. He floated above his own corpse, translucent and insubstantial, tethered to tomb by bonds he could feel but not see. He had done it, cheated death, achieved immortality of a sort. The triumph lasted approximately 3 seconds before reality of his situation became clear. He could not leave burial chamber. Attempting to move beyond its walls met invisible barrier, wards he had created now functioning as prison. He could perceive chamber and immediate surrounding corridors, but no further. Tomb had become his entire universe. He could not interact with physical world, except in limited ways. Moving objects required immense concentration and yielded minimal results. Speaking was possible but exhausting, voice emerging as whisper that few living beings would hear. He was observer more than participant, ghost watching world continue without him. And worst of all, maintaining coherent consciousness required constant effort. Without body to anchor identity, memories began drifting, thoughts fragmenting, sense of self growing diffuse. He had to actively work to remember who he was, what he had been, why his existence mattered. This was immortality, awareness without power, existence without purpose, prison he had built for himself. Outside Tomb, Sith Empire erupted into chaos. The news of Pall's death spread within hours. Sith lords who had circled during his final weeks now moved openly, each claiming right to succeed him as Dark Lord. Alliances formed and shattered. Assassinations began. Small-scale battles broke out across Korriban as different factions tested strength. The power struggle lasted 3 months, brutal conflict that claimed hundreds of lives. Eventually strongest emerged victorious. Sith Lord named Dathka, grandson of King Pall, had defeated lifetime ago. Dathka claimed title Dark Lord through combination of political maneuvering and raw power, defeating rivals in series of duels until none dared challenge him. Pall watched from his tomb, unable to intervene, forced to observe empire he had built tear itself apart, exactly as he had predicted. Dathka was competent ruler, but lacked Pall's vision, treated position as prize rather than responsibility. Empire would endure under his leadership, but barely, holding together through inertia rather than genuine strength. It did not matter. What Pall had created was bigger than any individual leader. The institutions he established continued functioning. Academies kept training new generations. Philosophy he articulated remained foundation of Sith civilization. Empire persisted not because of Dathka, but despite him. Years became decades. Dathka eventually died, killed by ambitious subordinate, who claimed Dark Lord title for herself. She ruled longer, nearly 40 years, expanding Empire's territory before being poisoned by her own apprentice. Pattern repeated. Dark Lord after Dark Lord rising and falling, some lasting years, others mere months. Pall lost count, eventually. Time became strange, thing for spirit trapped in tomb. Days blurred together, years passed like moments, decades felt like dreams. His memories continued fragmenting, pieces of past dissolving into fog of confusion. He forgot names of companions who had followed him into exile, forgot details of battles during 100-year darkness, forgot what it felt like to inhabit flesh, to breathe, to feel sunlight on skin, forgot gradually who he had been before becoming Dark Lord. Identity as Jedi Master fading until it seemed like story he had heard, rather than life he had lived. But Tomb attracted visitors, and visitors sometimes woke him from stupor of timeless existence. Sith Lords came seeking knowledge, attempting to access holocron or claim weapons from treasure chamber. Most died in trap-filled corridors, victims of defenses Pall had designed. Those who survived to reach burial chamber occasionally sensed his presence, felt weight of spirit watching them. Few attempted communication, fewer succeeded. Speaking required gathering consciousness into coherence, forcing fragmented awareness into something approximating personality. Process was exhausting, and Pall rarely bothered. But some visitors were compelling enough to warrant effort. A Sith Lord named Freedom Nad arrived approximately 400 years after Pall's death. Powerful, arrogant, seeking ancient knowledge to enhance his abilities, he breached Tomb's defenses through combination of skill and luck, reaching burial chamber with confidence of one who believed himself invincible. Pall manifested before him, gathering strength to speak. "Who disturbs my rest?" he whispered, voice echoing strangely in confined space. Freedom Nad did not flinch. "I am here to learn, Spirit. Share your knowledge, or be banished." Pall might have laughed if he remembered how. Banished? From Tomb he was bound to. Impossible. But Nad's confidence intrigued him, reminded him of himself in younger days, brilliant and certain of his own superiority. They spoke for hours, Pall sharing fragments of technique and philosophy, Nad absorbing everything greedily. When Nad finally departed, carrying holocron and several artifacts, Pall felt something like satisfaction. Knowledge would continue spreading. Legacy would persist. Centuries continued passing. Great hyperspace war erupted. Sith Empire finally making contact with Republic after millennia of isolation. War ended catastrophically for Sith. Republic forces crushing their fleets, forcing survivors to flee into unknown regions. Korriban was occupied, Tomb desecrated by Jedi, who feared knowledge it contained. Pall watched Jedi moving through his burial chamber, saw them destroy certain artifacts they deemed too dangerous, seal others away. They could not perceive him, force connection insufficient to sense trapped spirit. He screamed at them silently, rage filling empty corridors with energy they mistook for residual dark side presence. After Jedi departed, Tomb lay empty for generations. No visitors, no intrusions, just Pall alone with fragmenting memories and growing confusion about who or what he was. Identity dissolved further. He forgot his name sometimes, had to read it carved on sarcophagus to remember. Ajunta Pall, that was him, or had been him, or was still him. Distinction became unclear. He looked at 3 corpses in 3 sarcophagi, each withered and mummified, and could not determine which had been his body. All looked equally unfamiliar. All could have been him, or none. Did it matter? More centuries, more visitors occasionally. Tomb's reputation drawing seekers of forbidden knowledge despite dangers. Pall sometimes manifested, sometimes remained dormant, decision based on whim or confusion rather than conscious choice. He had conversations he would not remember having, gave warnings that went unheeded. Watched treasure chamber looted piece by piece, artifacts carried away by those who survived defenses. His twisted sword remained too dangerous to touch, too corrupted to claim. It hung on wall accumulating dust, waiting for hand that would never again wield it. Eventually even rage faded. Pall achieved something like acceptance of his fate. This was existence now, eternal awareness without purpose. Consciousness trapped in Tomb, observing time flow past like river around stone. He had sought immortality and achieved it, just not in form he had imagined. The dark side had delivered on its promises. As always, power without restriction, knowledge without limitation, existence without end, and absolute crushing, eternal emptiness. 3,956 years before the Battle of Yavin, a man named Revan entered Pall's tomb. The spirit had long since stopped tracking time with any precision. Years blurred into decades, decades into centuries. Pall existed in perpetual fog of confused awareness, sometimes lucid, more often drifting in timeless stupor, where past and present merged into incomprehensible whole. But Revan's arrival cut through that fog like lightning through darkness. The tomb's defenses activated as always when intruder entered. Traps triggered, wards engaged. Sith spirits bound to outer chambers manifested to attack. Pall felt it all distantly, automatic responses requiring no conscious involvement. Most visitors died in those outer sections. This one would probably be no different. Except he was different. Revan moved through tomb with purpose and skill that reminded Pall of something, though he could not quite remember what. The man deactivated traps through combination of technical knowledge and force ability, bypassed wards by redirecting their energy rather than confronting it directly, negotiated with bound spirits, offering them release from servitude in exchange for passage. By time Revan reached burial chamber, Pall was fully conscious for first time in decades, watching with interest he had not felt since when, he could not remember. Time was strange thing for spirits. Revan stood before 3 sarcophagi, studying them with expression Pall's could not read, then spoke, voice carrying clearly, in chamber's stillness. "I know you're here. I can feel your presence. Will you show yourself?" Pall hesitated. Speaking required effort, required gathering consciousness into coherent form, required remembering how to be person rather than just awareness. But something about this visitor compelled response. He manifested slowly, translucent form coalescing from shadows. Robes he had worn in life, face as it had been before final corruption, though details were uncertain now. Was this what he had looked like? He thought so. Maybe. "Who?" he whispered, voice echoing strangely. "Who are you?" "My name is Revan. I'm searching for star maps, ancient Rakatan technology. My quest brought me here." Pall stared at visitor, trying to focus thoughts that kept slipping away like water through fingers. Revan, that name meant something, or should mean something. Everything should mean something, but increasingly nothing did. "Why am I here?" Pall asked suddenly, question surprising even himself. Revan's expression softened with something like compassion. "You tell me, why are you still here?" "I don't." Pall started, then stopped. Why was he here? There had been reason once. Important reason. He had chosen this, prepared for it, bound himself deliberately to this place. But why? "I was important, powerful. I did something, built something." He looked around burial chamber, seeing carved walls, treasures, sarcophagi, evidence of significance he could no longer clearly remember. "You were Ajunta Pall," Revan said gently. "First Dark Lord of the Sith. You led the Dark Jedi into exile, discovered this world, founded empire that lasted millennia. Your philosophy shaped Sith civilization for thousands of years." Pall absorbed words, trying to connect them to fragmented memories.
Yes, that sounded right.
Familiar somehow. He had been, what did Revan call him? Dark Lord. First one. He remembered that, or thought he did. Memory and imagination had become difficult to distinguish. "I was Jedi once," Pall said suddenly, surprised by clarity of that particular recollection. "I remember. Temple on Coruscant, meditation, training. I was good at it. Important? You were Jedi Master," Revan confirmed, "one of greatest of your era." Then Pall struggled for words. "Then? No. I chose differently. Wanted to understand everything, not just what they permitted. Dark side, forbidden knowledge, power, without restriction. Yes, Revan said. I thought I was right, Pall continued, memories surfacing like bubbles from deep water. Thought Jedi were wrong to limit study of Force. Thought their restrictions were cowardice. I wanted freedom, knowledge, power, and I got it. All of it. Everything I wanted. He gestured vaguely at chamber surrounding them. Built empire, became God, achieved immortality, and I lost everything that mattered. Can't even remember what mattered anymore. Can't remember who I was before. Can barely remember who I am now. Pall looked at 3 sarcophagi, confusion evident even in translucent features. Which one is me? I can't remember which body was mine. They all look the same, or different. I'm not sure. Does it matter? Revan was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, voice carried weight of understanding. I know what you're feeling. Better than you might think. I fell to dark side myself, became Sith Lord, conquered half the galaxy, lost myself completely in pursuit of power. Only difference between us is I was redeemed, given second chance. You never got that. Pall stared at visitor, processing revelation. You fell and returned. How? Through sacrifice of those who loved me enough to risk everything pulling me back. Through being forced to confront what I had become. Through choosing in end to reject dark side, despite everything it had given me. Pall felt something stirring, emotion he could not name. Was it hope? Regret? He was not sure anymore. Is redemption possible, even now? After millennia? After everything I did? Revan approached closer, and Pall noticed lightsaber on his belt. Jedi weapon. This man who claimed to have been Sith Lord carried Jedi weapon. Contradiction that somehow made sense. Redemption is always possible, Revan said, if you genuinely want it, if you're willing to acknowledge mistakes and seek different path. But first you have to let go. Let go of power. Let go of legacy. Let go of everything tying you to this place. Pall looked around tomb again. His monument, his prison. 4,000 years of existence reduced to this, awareness trapped in stone watching world continue without him. I don't know how, he admitted. Don't remember how to be anything except this. Don't know who I would be if I let go. You would be at peace, Revan said simply. Released into Force, becoming part of something larger than yourself. No more isolation, no more confusion, just peace. The word resonated. Peace. How long since Pall had felt peace? Centuries at minimum. Perhaps never, if he was honest. Even as Jedi Master, he had been restless, hungry for more knowledge, more understanding. Never satisfied, never at peace. What about everything I built? He asked. Empire, philosophy. Students who learn from my teachings, does all that disappear if I let go? It endures or doesn't based on its own merit, not your presence, Revan replied. You've been gone from living world for thousands of years already, Empire continued. Your influence persisted. Letting go now changes nothing except freeing you from prison you built. Pall processed this. Thoughts moving slowly through consciousness that had forgotten how to think clearly. Prison. Yes, that was accurate. He had sought immortality and achieved imprisonment, had wanted to matter forever, and condemned himself to watching his own irrelevance. Tell me something, Pall said. Was I wrong about everything? About Jedi restrictions, about pursuing knowledge without limitation, about dark side offering freedom? Revan considered carefully before answering. You weren't entirely wrong. Jedi can be too restrictive, too afraid of knowledge, too rigid in their thinking. But dark side doesn't offer freedom. It offers addiction disguised as freedom, power that demands more power, knowledge that creates only hunger for more knowledge. You were right about problem, wrong about solution. That makes it worse somehow, Paul said quietly. If I had been completely wrong, it would be simpler. But I was partially right, which means I destroyed myself and countless others pursuing truth that was only half-truth. He looked at his translucent hands, barely visible in Chamber's dim light. What remained of Ajunta Pall after 4 millennia, fragment of consciousness too stubborn or too confused to release itself, ghost-haunting monument to its own ambition. I'm tired, Paul admitted. So tired. Tired of existing without living, tired of remembering and forgetting in endless cycles, tired of being alone with thoughts that don't make sense anymore. I just want it to end. Then let it end, Revan said gently. Let go of anchors binding you here. Release yourself into force. Find peace you've been denied for so long. How? Paul asked. I bound myself so thoroughly. Wards, rituals, spirit-binding techniques perfected over decades. I made prison too strong. Don't remember how to escape it. The same way you do anything in force, Revan replied. Through will. You bound yourself through will. You can release yourself same way. Just stop holding on. Stop fighting. Allow yourself to dissipate. Paul felt fear at suggestion. Dissipation meant ending, meant ceasing to exist as individual entity, meant giving up last remnants of identity he had clung to desperately across millennia. It meant death, true death, in way physical death had never been. But it also meant freedom. He thought about Jedi. He had been, lifetime ago. Young master full of questions and ambition. That person would be horrified by what he became, would weep at transformation from seeker of knowledge into monument of arrogance, would not recognize creature Pall had made of himself. He thought about dark Jedi who led rebellion against Jedi order, passionate, certain, convinced he was right and counsel was wrong. That person would be equally horrified, though differently, would see spirit trapped in tomb as failure, weakness, exactly the kind of helpless existence Darkseid was supposed to prevent. And he thought about Dark Lord he became, God King of Sith Empire. That person would see current state as abomination, living death more pathetic than any physical ending, would demand release through any means necessary. All versions of himself, from all periods of long existence, would agree on one thing. This had to end. I'm ready, Paul said. Or at least, I think I am. What should I do? Just talk to me, Revan said. Tell me what you learned, what you wish you could tell your younger self. Let your last act be sharing wisdom earned through suffering. Then, when you're finished, let go. Paul gathered what remained of his coherent consciousness, trying to crystallize thoughts that had been fragmenting for centuries. Tell them, he began slowly. Tell anyone who seeks Darkseid thinking it offers freedom, tell them, it's trap. Promises power, delivers slavery. Promises knowledge, delivers ignorance of what truly matters. Promises immortality, delivers existence worse than death. He paused, searching for words. I was not evil, not at start. I genuinely believed Jedi Order was wrong, thought their restrictions harmful. I wanted to help people by expanding understanding of force, good intentions, noble goals, and I destroyed myself and thousands of others pursuing them. Because Darkseid doesn't care about intentions. It takes whatever you are and corrupts it, turns your strengths into weaknesses. Your love of knowledge becomes obsession. Your confidence becomes arrogance. Your power becomes prison. And by time you realize what's happening, it's too late. You're already lost. Revan listened silently, allowing Pall to continue. Jedi aren't perfect, Pall said. Their fear of knowledge is real problem. Their restrictions do limit understanding, but they're right about one fundamental thing. Compassion matters more than power. Connection matters more than strength. Being part of something larger than yourself matters more than individual greatness. I forgot that, or never truly understood it. Built empire, achieved godhood, influenced galactic history across millennia, and I spent those millennia completely, utterly alone, unable to connect, unable to feel, unable to be anything except awareness watching universe continue without me. His voice, already quiet, became nearly inaudible. Don't make my mistakes. Don't sacrifice who you are for what you think you want to become. Don't pursue power at expense of everything that makes power worthwhile. And if you feel dark side calling, promising you everything, remember this: I achieved everything it promised, and it cost me everything that mattered. Silence filled burial chamber. Pall felt exhausted, more tired than he had ever been as a living being. Speaking those words, crystallizing 4,000 years of existence into coherent warning, had taken everything he had left. Thank you, Revan said quietly. I'll remember, and I'll make sure others know. Your warning will be heard. Good, Pall whispered. Maybe something good comes from all this. Maybe someone learns. Maybe someone avoids my fate. That would be something better than nothing. He looked around burial chamber one final time. Sarcophagi he could not identify. Sword he would never wield again. Treasures accumulated over lifetime of conquest and study. All of it meaningless now. All of it just debris of existence that should have ended millennia ago. I'm letting go now, Pall said. Don't know if I'll see you again. Don't know if there's anything after this. But thank you for listening, for caring enough to help me find end I should have found long ago. May the Force be with you, Revan said, using phrase Pall had not heard in thousands of years. Jedi blessing, somehow appropriate. And with you, Pall replied automatically, muscle memory from lifetime as Jedi Master surfacing one final time. Then he stopped holding on. The effort required to maintain coherent consciousness, effort he had been exerting constantly for millennia without realizing it, simply ceased. Wards binding him to tomb, anchors he had created with such care, released their hold as he stopped feeding them will and energy. Ajunta Pall, first Dark Lord of the Sith, began dissolving. It did not hurt. There was no pain, no struggle, no desperate final grasping at existence, just gentle dissolution, like fog burning away in morning sun. Memories released their hold. Identity loosened its grip. The fierce sense of self that had sustained him across centuries finally mercifully let go. In final moments before awareness dissipated completely, Pall experienced something he had not felt since days as young Padawan learning to meditate. Peace. Complete, absolute, perfect peace. All the striving, all the ambition, all the hunger that had driven him from Jedi to Dark Jedi, to Sith Lord, to trapped spirit, it all fell away. And what remained, just for instant before even that dissolved, was simple awareness of being part of something infinitely larger than himself. The Force, not light or dark, just Force itself, vast and eternal and uncaring in most beautiful way. He was part of it, always had been. All his efforts to stand apart, to be special, to matter individually, they had been fighting against truth he could finally accept. He was one note in infinite symphony, and that was enough. That was everything. Ajunta Pall dissolved into the Force, and for first time in 4,000 years, was at peace. Revan stood alone in burial chamber, watching empty space where spirit had been. He felt the moment of release, felt disturbance in Force as ancient consciousness finally allowed itself to end. felt perhaps the smallest whisper of gratitude before even that faded. He looked at 3 sarcophagi, a twisted sword on wall, a chamber that had been prison for so long. Then he turned and left, carrying with him warning from being who had learned too late the cost of ambition. Behind him, tomb fell silent. No spirit remained to watch. No consciousness lingered, just empty stone and forgotten treasures, and peace, finally, after so very long. The first Dark Lord of the Sith was gone, and in going, had achieved redemption no one thought possible for one so fallen. His legacy would endure in teachings and philosophy that shaped Sith civilization for millennia more. But Ajunta Pall himself, the being who had made choices and lived with consequences, was finally free. And that perhaps was all anyone could ask for in the end. 7,000 years of galactic history traced back to one decision made by one Jedi Master in the archives of the Coruscant Temple. The choice to study forbidden knowledge, the choice to reject limitations, the choice to pursue power without restriction. One man's rebellion against what he perceived as unjust authority, and the galaxy would never be the same. Ajunta Pall's legacy stretched across millennia in ways he could never have imagined during his lifetime. The Sith Empire he founded endured for thousands of years, rising and falling in cycles, but never truly disappearing. His philosophies shaped every subsequent Sith Lord, from Freedon Nad to Exar Kun, from Revan himself to Darth Bane. It was Bane, studying Pall's holocron 1,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, who would create the rule of 2. One master, one apprentice, the ultimate evolution of Pall's principle that strength should rule, refined into system, ensuring Sith would never again destroy themselves through internal conflict. Bane's rule would eventually produce Darth Sidious, who would bring the Jedi Order to its knees and establish galactic empire that Pall could only have dreamed of. Every Sith Lord across 7 millennia walked path Pall first carved. Every dark side technique, every forbidden power, every philosophy justifying domination through strength traced lineage back to him. He was the first, the founder, the prototype from which all others were copied. But his true legacy was not the empire, or the philosophy, or even the techniques he developed. His true legacy was the warning his existence provided, a cautionary tale about the cost of ambition, the seduction of power, the emptiness at the heart of darkside. He had been brilliant, talented, genuinely motivated by desire to expand knowledge and understanding. He had not set out to become monster. He had not intended to found civilization built on domination and fear. He thought he was pursuing truth, thought he was fighting for freedom. And step by step, choice by choice, justification by justification, he had transformed from idealistic Jedi Master into withered spirit, trapped in tomb for millennia, unable to remember his own identity, condemned to existence worse than death. The dark side had delivered exactly what it promised: power without restriction, knowledge without limitation, immortality of a sort. And in delivering those promises, it had destroyed everything that made them worthwhile. This was the lesson Pall's existence taught: not that seeking knowledge was wrong, not that questioning authority was forbidden, but that how you pursue goals matters as much as goals themselves, that some prices are too high, that power without wisdom, without compassion, without connection to something beyond yourself, becomes prison rather than freedom. Revan understood this lesson, carrying it forward as he walked his own complicated path between light and dark. Others would understand it too, across generations. Not everyone. Many would ignore warning, convinced they would be different, would be strong enough to wield darkside without being consumed. They would all be wrong. But some would learn, some would see Pall's fate and choose differently, would recognize seduction of dark side for what it was and turn away before it was too late. And for those individuals, Pall's suffering would not be entirely meaningless. Today, Korriban lies silent under its crimson sky. The Valley of the Dark Lords stretches empty, tombs of countless Sith Lords standing as monuments to ambitions that burned bright and faded to ash. Pall's tomb remains, weathered by millennia, but still standing, still radiating dark side energy, even though spirit that bound itself there is finally at peace. Occasionally, seekers still come, Force sensitives drawn by legends of power, waiting to be claimed. Some die in the traps. Some flee after glimpsing horrors the tomb contains. Few reach burial chamber, and those who do find only empty sarcophagi and sword too corrupted to safely touch. The holocron remains, though, Pall's teachings preserved in crystal, miniature version of him appearing when activated, ready to instruct anyone deemed worthy. But it is holocron created before his fall was complete, before he truly understood the cost of choices he had made. It teaches power and technique, but cannot teach wisdom earned through 4,000 years of tormented existence. That wisdom died with Pall when he released himself into the Force. Or perhaps not died. Perhaps it lives on in stories passed between Jedi and Sith alike, in warnings given to young Force users tempted by Darkseid's promises, in cautionary tales about greatest Jedi Master who became first Dark Lord. His name endures, Ajunta Pall, spoken with reverence by some, horror by others, but never forgotten. The first who fell, and in falling, shaped destiny of countless others across ages. The twin suns of Korriban set slowly, painting sky in deeper shades of crimson. Shadows lengthen across ancient valley, stretching from tombs like reaching hands. Night falls, as it has fallen for 7,000 years, bringing darkness to world already saturated with it. Stars emerge overhead, distant and cold and eternal. The same stars that shone when Pall first arrived as exile. The same stars that watched Empire rise and fall. The same stars that will shine long after last Sith Lord has crumbled to dust, and even legends fade to mythology. In the silence of Valley of the Dark Lords, wind whispers through empty tombs, sound like distant voices, though no one remains to speak. Echoes of ambitions that once burned bright enough to illuminate galaxies, now just whispers in darkness, barely audible over endless desert wind. Somewhere, in that vast force that connects all living things, perhaps fragment of what was once Ajunta Pall still exists, not as individual consciousness that dissolved long ago, but as part of larger whole indistinguishable from countless other beings who lived and died across galactic history. If such fragment retains any awareness at all, it knows peace. The striving is over. The hunger satisfied not through gaining more, but through wanting nothing. The quest for significance ended in acceptance of cosmic insignificance, and in that acceptance, strange as it might seem, lies contentment. The dark side promises everything, delivers emptiness, but beyond dark and light, beyond power and weakness, beyond individual ambition and cosmic purpose, lies simple truth that Pall learned too late, but learned nonetheless. Everything ends. Every empire, every philosophy, every individual existence, calling to them, brings only suffering. Accepting their impermanence brings peace, and peace, in the end, is all anyone truly needs. So rest now, in the knowledge that even the darkest stories eventually find their endings, that even the most tormented spirits can achieve release, that mistakes, no matter how catastrophic, need not be eternal. The galaxy continues its endless dance. Stars are born and die. Civilizations rise and fall. Force users walk paths between light and dark, making choices that shape their destinies. Some will remember Ajunta Pall and learn from his example. Others will forget and repeat his mistakes. This is the way of things. The cycle continues. Knowledge is gained and lost and rediscovered. Warnings are heeded and ignored. The Force flows through all of it, indifferent to outcomes, simply existing as it has always existed and will always exist. And in that eternal flow, in that vast, uncaring universe, individual stories matter and do not matter in equal measure. Tell's story mattered to him, mattered to those he affected, mattered to civilizations he shaped, but to universe itself, to force that encompasses all life, it was just one story among infinite stories, important and meaningless simultaneously. Perhaps that is the final lesson. Not that nothing matters, but that mattering is not the point. Existence itself is enough. Connection is enough. Being part of something larger, even if that something is too vast to comprehend, is enough. The night deepens over Korriban. Temperature drops, desert quickly releasing heat it gathered during day. Sand grows cold beneath crimson stars. Wind continues its eternal whisper through ancient stones. And somewhere, in space between moments, in the quiet that lies beneath all sound, there is peace. The kind of peace that comes only after longest journey, after hardest lessons, after everything that seemed important falls away, and what remains is simple awareness of being. This is how stories end. Not with grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but with quiet acceptance, with letting go, with release into larger patterns that we are part of, but cannot control. Thank you for listening to the story of Ajunta Pall, first Dark Lord of the Sith. If you enjoyed this journey into Star Wars legends, consider subscribing for more deep dives into forgotten tales from the galaxy far, far away. Or sleep well, knowing that even in darkness, peace is possible, that even after longest nights, understanding can come, that stories once told become part of us, teaching lessons we might not recognize until we need them most. The stars above Korriban continue their eternal watch. The tombs stand silent. The desert stretches endlessly in all directions. And in that vast emptiness, in that ancient silence, there is finally, mercifully, peace. Rest now. Let the story settle. Allow its lessons to sink deep into consciousness as sleep approaches. Tomorrow brings new stories, new lessons, new journeys, but tonight there is only this, the ending of one tale, the peace that comes after striving, the silence that follows the final word. And in that silence, everything and nothing at all